Hey there, my 5 faithful listeners and anyone who randomly stumbled upon this episode. My name is Lydia, and this is the Lydia Hill Pod. It all started from a wild idea and has turned into something I genuinely love. From deep dives into questions most people are too scared to research, to travel stories, faith talks, an occasional guest who has no idea what they're getting into, and everything in between. Expect to learn a lot, laugh a lot, and to leave with something worth talking about. Grab a glass of chocolate milk, settle in, and let's dive into the episode. In this episode, I want to talk about something that has come up a lot on my travels, and it's kind of awkward to say out loud, but here it is. Around the world, I am not saying this as someone who this comment has been about. I have been to 29 countries and counting so far, and I don't consider myself to fall into this category, but it still is part of my identity and it reflects on other people. Around the world, I have heard American tourists insulted, degraded, not necessarily rudely to their faces, but in backhanded comments, in jokes, in tones about American travelers. And hey, some of the stereotypes we deserve. We do it. I understand, and I make the joke all the time that Americans are very loud when compared to other cultures. You can notice a group of Americans because you hear them before you see them. And so, not talking about that stereotype. But a big part of the comments that I hear a lot are that Americans just don't travel. They don't know the world, they just stay at home. And look, as an American who has traveled, my first instinct is defend us, to be like, no, that can't be true. But I also do think it's worth asking the question and looking into what are the facts. So today, that's what we're doing. We are going to answer the question, are Americans untraveled? And if so, why? And is that even a fair thing to judge? Okay, before we can answer if Americans are untraveled, first we have to define our terms. What does it mean to be untraveled? How many miles away from home does that count? Does a road trip across the country count? Or does it have to be international? How many countries? Does it matter how long? If you're only there for a day, a week, a month, do layovers count? Does it matter how recent your travel was? Does a trip that you took as a kid in 1987 not count the same as one that you took last year? These are trivial questions. Depending on how you define travel, that will affect the answer of whether or not Americans are untraveled or not. Someone who drove from New York to California, who spent time in the Rockies, in the desert, in the Pacific coast, a handful of major cities, have they traveled? By most reasonable standards, I would say yes. But by the standard that gets applied in a lot of international conversations, it would be a no, since they never crossed a border. That idea of what untraveled means is important, and we need to keep that in mind throughout the rest of the conversation. Let me make the case for Americans first, because I genuinely think it deserves to be made. The comparison that always gets made is Europe. Europeans travel so much more than Americans. But here is what that's missing. A European country is often about the same size or smaller than an American state. The size of Germany is around the size of Montana. The entire United Kingdom is smaller than Oregon. The Netherlands could fit inside West Virginia. These comparisons, we don't even want to talk about how big Texas is. It is not comparable to say you're untraveled because I traveled to another country, which is 1 hour away from me, while you traveled 14 hours in the same state. It just doesn't compare. My then boyfriend and my best friend Kaylee, we went on a 54-hour road trip, and we went to 10 different states in the US. And we did that in 2 weeks. Every night we stayed in a different place. We went through 10 states, and only once did we come near a border of the country. So when a German leaves the country for a long weekend and goes through France and Belgium and the Netherlands, that's considered travel. But when a American drives 3 hours and barely crosses the border into another state in the same conversation that usually isn't considered travel. Just the simple distance is before we even talk about the different kinds of experiences that you can have in different states. You don't even have to leave the United States to see things like world-class canyon systems, mountain ranges that rival some in Europe, coastlines on 2 different oceans, old forests, actual deserts, swamps, glaciers, cities like New York, Chicago, Miami, New Orleans, San Francisco. Those are all so culturally different from each other, and that's without leaving a country. When I crossed the border from New Mexico to Texas, or Texas to Louisiana, or Alabama to Florida, these are so distinct from each other culturally, traditionally, even the kinds of dialects. It's all different. So the premise that staying inside the United States means that you've stayed home and you've seen nothing, that's not a fair premise. Americans who have genuinely explored their own country have experienced more geographic and cultural variety than a lot of international travelers give them credit for. This isn't to say that there isn't something missing. There are not that many language experiences that happen cross-culturally in America, but I think it is worth considering that someone could be well-traveled and never leave the border of the United States. Now, with that being said, the stats don't lie. About 50% of Americans have been to only 1 to 4 other countries in their entire life, and 27% of Americans have never left the country ever. That's nearly 3 in 10 people. So you line up 10 people, or you get in a small group of 10 people, and 3 of those people probably never left the country and probably never will. 48% of Americans hold a valid passport, which is great until you realize that means over half of Americans do not own a valid passport. If you compare to the UK, they have way more passports per citizen, and when you consider UK-born citizens, 8 to 12% of UK-born citizens live abroad. Not just visit, but live internationally. For the US, 1%. 1% live out of the US who are US-born citizens. I am in the 1% club. It's not evenly distributed. I would be mistaken not to mention that Americans who travel internationally tend to be older, tend to have a higher education, and tend to have higher income. So the people who don't travel internationally, it might not be because they don't want to. Now, there has been recent study by Preply where they showed that actually a lot of Americans don't want to travel internationally because they're scared of being in a place who speaks a different language. And that's a whole other thing. We will definitely be talking about languages in a future episode. But even traveling internationally to English-speaking countries is still pretty low for being a first world country. So my question was, how can we make it comparable? I don't want to say, oh, they've never left the country, so they're untraveled. All of that is talking about foreign international travel. And as I said earlier, the US is very vast. So what is the comparison for people within the United States? So let's look at when people leave their own home state. This was also very, very unfortunate. 11% of people, so 1 in 10, a little over 1 in 10, have never left their home state, ever. As much as I want to defend Americans, and partially I do, I have to be honest. Compared to the rest of the developed world, US citizens on average are much less traveled internationally. That's just what the data shows. I don't think that's the whole story. I think there's a reason why. I don't think it's just as simple as Americans don't care about the world. If you start with geography, the US is enormous, and it's bordered by 2 oceans. You have the Atlantic and the Pacific. Getting to Europe from the American Midwest isn't a budget flight on a Friday afternoon. You can't take Ryanair for a couple hours. It's a transatlantic journey that takes most of a day and costs a lot of money. Round trip flights just from here in Cyprus to the States, I have to take a layover. There's no direct flights from anywhere near the south, near Atlanta or Nashville. And so I'm having to fly through a layover in London or somewhere else, and it takes around a day or a day and a half to get from here to there. The flights are at minimum 6 hours from the UK to the US, but it's even longer depending on wind and storms and other things. Sometimes flights up to the north versus to the south or to across the US might be up to 10, 11 hours. Europeans have an advantage when it comes to just how close all of the countries are. The closest country to me in Tennessee at home would probably be, I don't know, it would be a close call between Canada and Mexico. And they're both at least a 12 to 15 hour drive. When you consider that, you also have to add in Americans and vacation time. American work culture is so different from most of the world. The US is one of the only developed countries without mandated paid vacation. So most of my friends in the US only get 2 weeks paid vacation off, or unpaid, but they get 2 weeks vacation that they're allowed to take a year. And then some of them get more weeks, or some of them have a little more flexibility. Like, I grew up on a farm, so when you are your own boss, when you're a farmer or something like that, you have a little more flexibility. But the people who are working 9 to 5s in the US are not getting as much vacation time as Europeans. All of my friends who visited me in London were there for a long weekend, like 4 days, and everyone in London was saying, "What do you mean? You're not here for 2 weeks minimum?" And they were like, that means I couldn't go anywhere else for the rest of the year. I couldn't take off. Some people are using sick days to travel in the US. Real story. Is that right? Is it a lie? Well, that's also another topic. But nonetheless, Americans do not have it as easy when it comes to travel. My now husband took off multiple weeks, and he had, I think, at least 30 days of the year he could take off for work. So he was able to come to the US 5 weeks in the year and visit me, while all my friends are like, "Do you even have a job?" Because in the US, that would not happen. When your travel window is maybe you take 1 week vacation a year, and then you have to add at least 2 travel days to fly somewhere internationally that's not in Latin America, it adds up. And is the cost worth the benefit? A lot of people decide, I'll just go to Florida or to California or to New York or somewhere that I can fly easily, and it will be cheaper, it will be easier to plan. I don't have to also pay for a passport and pay for all of these other things. It is probably a lot to do with practicality. Also, the healthcare system does not help when it comes to travel. We do not have a nationalized healthcare system, and travel insurance, international health coverage, the general anxiety of just getting hurt or sick while abroad, that's a real fear for Americans. It wouldn't necessarily apply to someone traveling from a country with universal health care who, I know that my husband's healthcare is easier to apply in other European countries. Well, once you leave the US, or sometimes once you leave your state, your healthcare is not the same. And so we have to buy travel insurance. Well, travel insurance adds up. It is on average $20 a week for a healthy young American. But if you're older, or you have lots of health complications, or you're traveling for a long period of time, the price can really increase. My grandmother and my dad came to London in November, and the difference for their health insurance, their travel insurance, was crazy. My dad ended up paying like $40, but my grandmother, who is perfectly healthy, she's just older. She's in her 80s, and she had to pay more than 3 times the amount that my dad had to pay. It did not make sense, but that's just the way that American healthcare works. So that is also a factor. None of that excuses a lack of curiosity about the world or someone who's just lazy and doesn't want to travel. But these are legitimate reasons that should be considered before framing Americans in a negative light because they don't leave the country. So, are Americans untraveled? Honestly, compared to the rest of the developed world, on average, yes. The stats are the stats. They don't lie. But I do think that there are important contexts to frame that conversation in, and not all Americans are untraveled. So let's not stereotype or generalize. I have many friends from the US who have recently gone out of the country for the first time, and it's been because they couldn't afford it before, or their family or home environment had discouraged travel, or maybe they were scared. And I would just encourage anyone listening, if you have not traveled, you should do it. Travel, whether it's across state borders, across international lines, experience things that are different from you. You will grow so much from that experience. When you don't speak the language, when the food is all foreign, when the history around you is completely different from what you and your lineage has come from, it builds an appreciation for God's creation, for the people, and humanity in general, how we all are the same, even when we're different. I've noticed through traveling, kids are the same everywhere in the world. They're joyful and they like to play. Animals may look different. Mountains may look different. There's lots of unique experiences that you'll grow from. Hearing a different language, struggling to understand someone, working through patiently to try to order food. Those things build your character and build your ability to love other people and show grace in differences. You obviously know from the subtitle of my podcast that I am a big fan of travel. So this episode, it was due. That's it. Case closed. Are Americans untraveled? Kind of mostly yes, but there are lots of Americans who have traveled, and when you consider internal, between states traveling, lots of Americans are traveled. There is a chart that I shared on Instagram, and it shows all of the other countries and who has left their country and who's traveled where. Americans falls almost at the very bottom of all developed countries, but we're still above a few, like Japan and some others. So I would say that there are people less traveled than Americans. Still, maybe we can step up our game. Let's all go somewhere new this year. That's a wrap on this episode of the Lydia Hill Pod. And honestly, the fact that you're still here challenges my belief that I only have 5 consistent listeners. If something we talked about today stuck with you, or you have thoughts, topics, or questions you want me to dig into, send me a message on any of my socials. And if you know someone who likes a good laugh, is trying to find their way, or just really needs to know this, send it their way. As always, love God, love people, love travel, love life. Thanks for spending time with me. See you in the next one.